So graphs can be a great way of presenting information, presenting data in an easy visual capture. But if you are creating your own graph, then it's important to think about what makes an effective graph. So effective graphs can certainly be beneficial in data analysis, but if you have distorted or misleading graphs or ineffective graphs, can also go the other way and contribute to misinformation and confusion. So just some sort of rules of thumb around creating an effective graph or working with an effective graph would be the following. So the first point is that an effective graph should be relevant and it should be meaningful. So there's different ways of sort of interpreting that idea, but if you think about the following chart, so the following showing cigarettes, so assuming cigarette usage between female and males, and it's showing us our information over here that female represented about 54.25% and males represented about 45.75%. So again, this graph is okay. It gives us some information. It certainly does label, and we can see the representation of male versus female. But the idea that a graph needs to be relevant and meaningful, just because you can graph it doesn't mean you should graph it. So this could be just a line in a report that says approximately half the subset or half the group is female and half of the group is male. So again, it's showing us a graph, but the argument could be that is it relevant, is it meaningful? You should be showing a graph that's distinctly showing trends and creating a meaningful story. Second thing, very tied into the first one, is that a graph should clearly show any trends or differences in the data. So the following is a representation of world population. So most of us in our head sort of have the idea of what's happening in world population, that we generally see it as sort of the idea of exponential growth. So if you ever see world population or population, we have this sort of exponential growth in population. Whereas if you kind of look at this one, it's not really showing that sort of exponential format. You kind of see a bit of a curve, but I would argue that the idea of using a pictograph and that one person represents 1 billion people, that it's not clearly showing the trend in the world population and how it's projected in 2070 to blow right up, right? So again, graph is fine, it's labeled appropriately, etc., but it needs to clearly show those differences, and this one might not be showing that. You might sort of see it as a linear or gradual increase, depending on how you sort of interpret the graph. Number 3 says that it should accurately show the facts. So this one is the same information represented in 2 different ways. So if you just look at the first one and you say, okay, for example, in year 3, which has a better return on investment, group A or group B? And it's really hard to tell with a 3D image, but when you flip it to a 3D version, you can see which of the groups are actually ahead or higher in terms of return on investment. So again, the idea of skewing information, especially with a 3D or 3-dimensional sort of perspective, looks interesting, but not always the best way to represent accurate information. Another sort of general line or rule of thumb is that an effective graph should definitely have a title and clear labels. So this one, taking a look at it, it's obviously a pie chart, but it's in grayscale, and unfortunately it's really hard to tell between the values which should be which. So it's not necessarily that it should be labeled in color, but that perhaps these should be labeled actually on the graph with their percentage values, so that it's a lot easier to just pull out the distinct chunks. So we can't really make the distinction of what is the largest slice here. So again, it's important to make sure that we are labeling and knowing what exactly we're taking a look at. And finally, an effective graph should be what we call simple and uncluttered with no chart junk. So if you look at something like the following graph, it is a graphical representation, obviously has information, but I would argue that there's way too much going on. So we have a map. Within the map, we have little pie charts. Within the pie charts, we have colors associated with things. We also have labels associated with things. So it's actually really hard to pull off any relevant information little bit too overwhelming. You want to make sure that your graph is simple and it creates a meaningful trend that's easy to actually interpret information off of.